Hello and welcome everybody back to episode 10. Oh my gosh, we're at episode 10. This is episode 10 of the HamRadioConcepts podcast. I am Eric KJ4YEY. I started HamRadioConcepts on YouTube many years ago and did a lot of videos because of the passion of ham radio that I do. And then I decided in 2022 that, we need to start getting going with the podcast because this is where everybody's at. And the podcast is not for me, it's for us, because I want to connect with a lot of people and talk with people and learn stuff and have something for you to listen to when you're on the way to work, if you're at work, if you're home and you got into the funk listening or watching Netflix on the TV on the couch. Turn it off. Go turn on the podcast and listen to it. And there's many ways to listen to this podcast. We are on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Podchaser, Amazon, Google Podcasts, so many. Anywhere you look for a podcast, you will find it. But if you want that traditional AM shortwave radio feeling, you can listen on Wrmi Shortwave from Okeechobee, Florida, 9.395 megahertz facing North America, 5.950 megahertz facing Europe, and some in North Africa. And of course, people tell me they listen on one where they shouldn't hear it, but it comes in. WRMI's got, 100,000 watt transmitters that are going out across the world, and you never know where the propagation will take you. So I am Eric Hofer, KJ4YEY, and episode 10. Man, this podcast has gone all over the world, and I didn't think it would. I would be that entertaining or informative, but I got to tell you, this episode is going to be probably one of my favorite and probably the most interesting. I have a guest here, and I want to introduce my guest. I've talked to Tom here on D-Star before. I've talked to him, on the phone, a buddy of mine, and this is something that I have an interest in talking to him on this podcast. So this is not just to make material for this. This is me being very interested, and I want everybody to introduce or to welcome, and I want Tom to introduce himself. Welcome, Tom KF4YEY to the Ham Radio Concepts podcast. Hello, Tom.
Hi there, Eric, and appreciate the introduction. It's going to be a pleasure speaking to you this evening about whatever topic you come up with. There's no question about it. And I'm honored to be here. And I've listened to a few of your podcasts before mine so I can get a feel for the format of things. And I'm happy with what you're doing. And I've seen many of your videos. And when I got back into ham radio 4 years ago, yours were some of the videos that I found on the internet. And I've liked your channel and subscribed to your channel since day one, since I found it. So that's just how it goes.
Well, Tom, and Tom, tell me if I'm ever out of line or whatever. I want to tell everybody that Tom here, KF4YEY, you live in Orlando, right, Tom?
Yeah, I do.
Tom is completely blind. And this is a subject that has come in comments. I have a blindness in one eye. I have one eye that's gone, but Tom is completely blind. And the big thing about this is that when I met Tom, I had no idea, but he had told me that he operates ham radio completely blind. And this is some of the things we want to talk about. Tom, I have other questions after we get into this because, again, this podcast goes wherever it goes. Nothing's scripted. I talked to him on the phone today, and I said, listen, I don't want to, talk about anything really because I want it to be all fresh in the podcast. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. There's no reason to, exhaust all the material ahead of time and have it all pre-planned.
Yes. And is there any sensitive subjects with your disability? Because I'm not meaning anything, wrong or I don't know the word, but I have questions and I want to ask you, is there anything sensitive? Because I have questions, and my wife even gave me a question or two, and I am just fascinated to talk to you, Tom, and thank you for giving me the time to be on here, because I think a lot of people are going to appreciate this episode. I really do.
Absolutely not. The way I got to look at this stuff is, when somebody asks me a question, whatever it is, it's 99 times out of 100. It's because they truly don't know, or they want to know, And it's to my benefit and everybody else's benefit that I approach a situation and these types of opportunities from an educational standpoint. So I wouldn't be scared of anything like that.
Okay. Yep. That is very cool. So, Tom, give everybody before we start conversating and stuff, introduce yourself. Tell everybody, how old you are, how long you've been at Ham Radio. The floor is yours, man.
Right. So I'm going to be 42 in May, and so my ham radio career started when I was 18 years old. I got my license when I was 18, but I didn't really do too much with it after about 2 or 3 years. I did VHF, analog repeaters and stuff like that from 18 until I was about 21 or 22. And then I got out of it and didn't touch it for 20 years. And then it was time for me to renew my license again in 2018. And I said, well, am I going to renew this license or am I going to not? So I decided to renew it, see what clubs were out there. And so I called the local club up here in Orlando with the Lake Monroe Amateur Radio Society Club over here. And the guys have been really helpful and got me on the air and taught me a thing or two about a thing or two I didn't know. And along the way, I do the same.
So Tom, what got you into ham radio, man? What was the reason you did that?
Well, there was a gentleman when I was a child. He, well, let me just back up. My mom, she used to clean the Palm Beach International Control Tower back in the 1980s, between let's say 87 and 96 or so, and there was a gentleman there who had a son that was around my age, and he took me under his wing and, took me over his house a few times, and I became friends with him and his son. And one day he took me over to a guy named Dave Wasco's house who lived out in the acreage, where they had a lot of land, and he had ham radio antennas, and I was about maybe 10 or 12 years old. I don't remember the exact age, but within that age range. And he showed me the ham radio, and I learned, later that it was a 40-meter band. We were working during the daytime, and he let me talk to another blind guy down in Key West that he knew. I don't remember the guy's name or anything like that, but that's kind of what sparked it. And from then on, I went and got scanners. I got a CB 13. I got my mom to get that for me, and then used that for a while, and used that when I was going back and forth to school on the weekends, because I used to go to a residential school in St. Augustine. And we used to go back and forth every week, and so I'd use that on the bus. And so it was a good times at that. And then when I was about 17 or 18, they decided they would do a ham radio class, and I jumped in that. And me and about 3 or 4 other guys, we got our licenses, and some of them are still licensed today, and some of them aren't. But I'm kind of from what I know out of that potential group, I'm the only one who really kept the spirit of it alive. But here I am, and I got into HF 4 years ago. Got back into VHF with those digital modes, and so that's kind of what I did. And through some club outlets and stuff, they helped me get me on the air and helped me get my proficiency in CW up, so that I can operate my little antenna setup here that I got in my homeowners association apartment, whatever I got here, and that's effective and it works.
Well, we're going to talk about your antennas and HOA. And by the way, let me just, because you said 18, you said you got your license, right?
Yeah, that was 1998.
So I'm going to dedicate this show. I want to just give a shout out to everybody listening here who's followed me all these years. My Elmer, I found out a couple nights ago that he had passed away. He, KF4YEY, Patrick, was the one that got me into ham radio. And for years, we've tried to help him out. We've came over and tried to help him out. He had some medical issues and stuff, but we found out weeks later that they found him deceased in his house. And it broke my heart, because that was the guy, when I was 18, I met him on the CB radio. And I've told this story many times, Tom. You may have not heard it, but a lot of the podcasts and stuff, I've talked about it. I met him on a CB when I was about 18. I needed a PL259. I was talking to him. I had an amplifier. He had an amplifier. We were talking. He said, come on over. I'll give you one. And right away, I was like, well, this is kind of weird. This was 20-something years ago, Tom. And I went over to his house, and he's like, hey, Cole, you're in the CB radio, but have you ever heard of ham radio? And I'm like, well, I heard about it. And he brought me into his house. He had an ICOM V8000, 65 watt, 2 meter only rig. And he said, watch this. He pushed a button, and the local 146.640 machine, he pushed the button and keyed it up, and it said W4PHJ repeater. And then it said the time is 5 p.m. Good evening. I was like, oh my God, it talks. He goes, yes, man, this is way cooler than CB, but we've always kept, me and him were always kept in CB radio for all these years. So, Patrick, the show is dedicated to you because I miss you, buddy, and thank you for everything you've taught me. I love you, and that was just something I had to say, Tom, because, that's, if it wasn't for him, man, I wouldn't be here doing a podcast with you today. So everybody listening, you thank your Elmer when you can, because your Elmer is the one that gets you into it. And sometimes our Elmers are not there anymore, and mine is not now, but
right.
I don't forget it. So before we get into this, because I have some questions for you, Tom, we're going to go into this. If you're new to the podcast and you're listening, you might be listening on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Podchaser, so many more. Search HamRadioConcepts, all one word. Okay. And if you're wanting, or maybe you're listening on AM shortwave, you can listen on the podcast and download it whenever you want. Or if you're listening on a podcast, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. every Sunday night, Eastern Time, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m., 9.395 megahertz or 5.950 megahertz. You can listen to this podcast with that AM shortwave radio feeling. Send us signal reports at hamradioconcepts@gmail.com. And give a thanks and a signal report to WRMI.net and tell them what you think of the show, the signal report, what you're listening on. And thank you, WRMI, for letting me buy these time slots. Because, someone can come in here, Tom, and just buy everything, and then I won't have a chance. So thank you for WRMI for letting me buy these. Tom, let's get into this now. So when I met you on D-Star, we've talked on D-Star in the mornings, and I said something to you. When I first met you, you said you had seen my videos or you heard my videos. And I said, did you see on this video? And you said, Eric, I can't see. I'm blind. Now, I didn't know how to take that. I remember when I said that, and I remember when you responded. But then you had explained to us that you were completely blind. You operate ham radio every day as a blind with a disability. And tell us now about, because I get a lot of these comments. When I do a video on a radio and people say, Eric, we are, a lot of people, you wouldn't believe it, Tom, handfuls and handfuls of emails come in. I am a disabled ham. I have zero vision. I'm blind or impaired vision, whatever. What can this radio do for me? Or how, you haven't gone into the review part of if this has assistance for blind hams. Tom, as a ham radio operator, you are very proficient at what you do. I've talked to you. I've heard about your antenna design. Tell me about it. Tell us about it. Being a blind ham and using radios in 2022 to talk to people all across the world.
Right. So by and large, when it comes to what radios to obtain and all that, the best manufacturer in general who's put the most effort into accessibility with ham radios in general is by far the Kenwood brand. And so the Kenwood radios by far have the ability to read the changes that you make in the radios, and they make it really easy to turn it on. For example, the HF radios, they have the chip that does the voice logging that you can do where you do the recording and you can play it back. Well, they also add a screen reader into that chip that basically reads all the settings of the radio, so that when you're pushing those buttons on the control head or the front panel on the radio, it'll tell you what you're doing. And what I found that's really interesting and cool about that, even for sighted people, is some of these radios are used in mobile environments, and if somebody learned how to touch that radio with the keypad and stuff without having to look at it, and they could listen to that speech, that would also be able to help them in a way that they probably never considered before. So in general, the Kenwoods are the radios you really want to go after. And then, with other external devices, plugging into serial ports, you can get Elecraft radios and make it work. But the other two manufacturers of ICOM and Yaesu, don't put as much effort into accessibility in general, just because their systems just work differently and they have a different market they go after. So,
But are you talking about just a voice synthesizer that will tell you the frequency, the mode, and the band you're on, or are we going more than that?
it's absolutely more than that, because you know that's only the basics. You know, you have to, in these radios, you have to be able to access the menu systems. You have to be able to know what's going on inside the settings, and in the Kenwood environments, it reads all that stuff. And even in the, what's also interesting that's interesting about even cheaper radios like the Baofangs and the Watsons of the world, or Oshangs, or whatever that brand is called.
No, I call it Ocean, Ushan. Nobody
Right.
knows how to pronounce it.
So what's interesting about those radios is they have a little speech engine in them too. And what's interesting about those is those have menus that are very keyed. So you say menu button and then menu number 15, and then that menu 15 corresponds to a setting, so that's very square. And so all you really have to do is get a little chart in front of you with the menu options, with 1 through 30 or whatever they have, and you can pretty much change anything you want, because it'll tell you when you make those changes what they are.
Right. So,
Even on those, a lot of Chinese radios will do that.
I never thought about this, that when, I thought it was annoying when I got a Baofeng years ago when they first came out, and you turn it on, it would go beep, beep, channel mode or frequency mode, and you hit the menu button, it says menu. And then you hit, I know for a fact that the Baofengs, I would go menu 26, menu 25, and menu 13. That was the offset, the shift, and the tone. And with menu
Right.
26,
And then what you do with those is you just count some of the offsets. You just count them what they are, and you get another chart that has all your 38 offsets. And you really only need, let's say, two of them. Like 14 is usually like 107.2, or 13 is 107 103.5, something like that.
Right.
So you just memorize a couple of values that way, and you can make those radios workable.
Well, okay, so let's back up here, Tom. So, were you born blind?
Absolutely. I was born with a eye condition called retinopathy of prematurity, which is basically a condition where the eye is not fully developed, because I was premature, so they put me in the incubator to keep me alive. And the side effect to the high oxygen levels to keep me alive, it burns out your optic nerves. But they actually have fixed that issue since then, probably about 2 or 3 years after I was born, where kids don't have that problem anymore when they're born and all that. So that condition is relatively being cured.
So so specifically, you've never seen a ham radio screen or a ham radio. I mean, you can feel the knob, you can get an idea with your touch on how the radio looks, but you've never seen like a menu on a touch screen on a 7300. Is that valid?
Absolutely. I have no memories of being able to see. The most, when it comes to vision, the most vision I've ever had was a light perception when I was a little kid, maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, and then as time went on, even that went away.
Wow.
And light perception is basically be able to tell when somebody turns a light on in the room and when they don't.
Wow. So I think it's really impressive, man, because from my understanding, visually impaired or blind people can have more of a sense of touch and smell than they do of sight. So I'm pretty sure what kind of radios do you have, Tom? Tell us what kind of radios you have and what you use, because I know in my head, if I went blind tomorrow, I can kind of guess what some of the radios I use and where the buttons are, but never seeing that or not being able to read the labels on the buttons. What does that mean to you?
Okay, so by and large, like I say, I have a lot of Kenwood gear. I have two main HF radios. I've got the Kenwood TS480 and the TS590S. And both of those, the keypads on them basically talk. When you hit a button, it'll tell you what it is, tell you how it works, and and then for the HT side of life, I have one of those Oshangs, like everybody owns, the Baofangs, that sort of thing. And then I have the Kenwood DHT74, which has the speech engine, which all you have to do is when you turn it on, if you hold down the pound sign as you turn the radio on, it turns the speech engine on, and if you hold the pound sign again, it'll turn it off as you.
Okay, so hold on, pause, because when you get a new radio, Tom, do you have to have someone to tell you where the pound button is and say, hey, look in the menu here, it says how to turn it on, and to show you that, or do you figure it out by yourself?
So what I did in the beginning was I went and saw to see where the manual in the Kenwood radio is. How do I enable speech out of the box? And like I say, Kenwood assumes that you don't have sighted help around. So if you go get the book for it real quick, the first thing it'll say is, hey, if you want to enable accessibility, hold down the pound key when you turn it on.
But if I'm fascinated by.
Okay,
this.
So you want to know how I determined where the pound key was?
Well, right.
On that radio.
So you just
on the radio, the 5 has a dot on it.
Hold on a second. So you mean it has like a braille kind of feeling on the button?
It's not really braille, but it's more like a little raised thing where you could tell it from other buttons. And so when you take the radio out of the box and you put it in your hand, you can kind of feel on the radio that it does look like a 12-button keypad. And then to help you orient yourself, it does have the little dot on the 5, and so that you can use that as a reference point. So you say, okay, 5's in the middle, and then you say, well, the pound must be on the right bottom.
I see. Okay. So I'm assuming you've listened to YouTube videos before, and you've listened to people talk about this, and that gives you an idea when the radio arrives in your hand from where you order it, that you know what you're looking for. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so not only do I use YouTube videos for that, but I also used YouTube videos to try to help me determine, is this a radio that I might want to buy from its audio perspectives of, when people make contacts on the air with it.
I see. Man, Tom, I got to say, you are definitely what's the word I'm looking for? Self-sustained, self-sufficient, self-reliant. Yeah, because I mean, Tom, there are people out there that have been licensed longer than I have, and I was licensed in 2005, and with vision and watching YouTube videos and having vision and stuff, they still have trouble sometimes with manufacturers on the way they made the menu structure and this and that. And from what I've gathered, you've figured out with Kenwood, who has an accessibility issue for vision impaired, that you can operate radios, and this is, again, going out to the people that listen to my YouTube videos and stuff, and they say, well, some of these people went blind 5 years ago, but they play with radios their whole life, and you're self-reliant that you can actually do this, and it's just amazing, Tom. It really is.
Right, and there are other manufacturers that also have radios that are accessible, like the Ellercraft line of radios is accessible with the help of an external device called a ham pod, which, basically what those radios do is you make changes to them. It sends everything out the serial port of those radios, and the device basically responds back and tells you what it's doing. And then it even has some built-on functions where you can change the frequency, change menus. And so, other manufacturers have, like Ellercraft, do a lot with their rig control options to make it possible to develop third-party devices that will do things that they probably never envisioned.
So that pod you were talking about, is that a Kenwood device?
No, that ham pod is actually, it's a device developed by one individual who sadly was forced to stop making them for various reasons. And terrible. He actually was not making them anymore, and I actually probably obtained one of the last 20 he had.
Wow. And wow, if man, because, I know a bunch of people would be interested in that, but I guess there's no way to plug the guy or anything on what he's making because he doesn't get to sell them anymore, right?
Well, the device actually could be reinvented again. I mean, that device was using a lot of older technologies, which are very hard to come by these days with the whole chip things that are going on now, that things have to be redesigned, and he knew that. It's just that, someday somebody will redesign it again under like an Arduino or a Raspberry Pi form factor, and
sure.
Before it's all over, I might be a collaborator on our project to do that. So
yeah, he would be he would be somebody that would have hands-on and perfect feedback for something like that. Sure. I have another question, a few questions for you, but here,
Absolutely.
If you're new to the podcast or anybody listening, this is Tom KF4YEY, and we're talking with him on the Ham Radio Concepts podcast. Send an email about this show to HamRadioConcepts@gmail.com and tell me what you think about it. Give me some feedback, criticism. Tell me where you're listening. If you are listening on shortwave from WRMI 9.395 megahertz facing North America, 5.950 megahertz facing Europe and North Africa, and send WRMI at WRMI.net a signal report and what you think about the show, and tell them you like hearing me on there or you don't like hearing me, whatever. Anywhere you can get podcasts, you can find this. Ham Radio Concepts on Apple Podcasts, on your Apple iPhone or smartphone or your iPad, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, everywhere you can find it. Ham Radio Concepts podcast. And this is episode 10, so I'm having so much fun here on this episode with Tom here. Tom, tell us, Tom, what we've already talked about before. Tell us about your career or whatever you want to tell us about that. But what you do for work or for career as a vision impaired like that. What do you do?
So I'm a network and voice engineer for a small ITSP, which is basically a company that provides phone services to small and medium businesses, like their PBXs. So you have an office and you want to be able to talk to the people, down the hall or whatever, or even across to the different office in a different location. Well, I'm one of the main engineers on that project that we basically sell that to the general public. And so basically I'm responsible for all the systems that run that all the way through from the provider all down to the end user. Sometimes, I'll do the support right to the end user all the way up to the, hey, if there's a problem passing traffic over an outside provider, well, I deal with that too.
So I'm familiar with PBX systems, and I worked at AT&T years ago. And how do you collaborate or work with or program this kind of stuff the way you do? How does it work for you in a daily routine?
Okay, so basically I have a screen readers for the different operating systems that I use. And under Windows, I use JAWS, which is a commercial screen reader that will read the screen to me as to what comes across. And then I can read the web pages and, do things into the input fields and things like that. And then for server management, I like to use the Linux operating system because it's like a command line, driven type of thing, kind of like DOS, but like DOS on steroids. So I use a different screen reader for that. And that's kind of how it is. So for every system that I work with, there's a different speech engine that controls that system so that it uses the strengths or the weaknesses of that system to accomplish whatever it needs to accomplish.
So if you have a computer and you use a screen reader or accessibility mode, how do you turn it on? Can you sit down in front of anybody's computer and know how to turn it on? Or is it something that's built into your computer that you're familiar with?
So in modern computers these days, there's a rudimentary screen reader built into every Windows system called Narrator. And so what you do is you basically sit down at that machine and you can hit the Windows key, enter, and you can get a basic rudimentary screen reader. And then what we use that for is we use that to then load our third-party screen reader, whether it's JAWS, which is a commercial one I use, or NVDA, which is an open source one. And you basically use the Narrator to get you going. Then you can install the other one after you get the system jump started.
Okay, so you know the keyboard layout to the T, and you know how to get into anybody's computer to do that. But I mean, what if there's windows popping up on the screen and you can't see them? How do you know what window you're looking at, or what to do, or what if the program launched or if it didn't launch, or it's in your way because a pop-up popped out? How do you know that?
Well, sometimes that can be an issue. For example, if somebody improperly shuts down a system and it comes up and says repair mode or something like that, well, then I wouldn't necessarily know that. So there are some caveats sometimes as to why you may or may not be able to do that. But there's through years of experience when it doesn't do that for you, when it doesn't load that way, you kind of get an idea for what it is. And sometimes it's one of these things to where it's not the big things that get in your way that cause you not to be able to do things. Sometimes it's just a very small thing, one screen that you can't see to get around that stops a freight train. And that's usually what it is sometimes. It's not usually big problems that get in your way. It's the small little things that if you only had vision for about a half second, you'd be able to get through.
Man, that's wow. Yeah, that's got to be frustrating. So do you use a smartphone or a tablet, Tom?
Yes, I have both platforms. I have iOS and Android, but my primary daily driver is the iPhone because it has the best support for screen access, and Android has it too, but it's taken a lot longer. And as you know, just like every other preference in the world, either you're an Android customer or you're an iPhone customer. Most people don't really do both because the learning curves that are different on both systems in general. So I learn both because I want to be able to help as many people as I can.
Man, that's amazing. So I know that you could turn on the assistive technologies to where if somebody calls in or texts you, it'll read it out to you, correct?
Right.
Right.
And not only that, it also reads all the applications when you scroll across the screen. So when you want to go to your messages app and you want to read those messages, or you go to your email and you want to look at your email, there's a way of doing that in a way to where you can do that just by feel. And so, if you're the way I would do it if I was a sighted person is if I was at nighttime and I was in bed and I wanted to do something but I couldn't see and I didn't want to turn on the lights, I'd put a pair of headphones into that phone and turn on that accessibility mode and go to town.
Wow. Well, I give you mad respect, bro, because it's got to be something that I think almost everybody listening, could not fathom. And man, I don't like I don't. What do I want to say, Tom? I don't feel bad for you. I enjoy what you've done and how you're doing this. Like that is a motivation for me because, if that's the right way of saying it, I don't mean any disrespect or anything. I think that, man, you are just out there like everybody else, but you have a disability that almost everybody can't relate to. Does that make sense?
Right. It's because in general, the way that it was told to me many years ago is that basically people in general learn 80 to 90% of everything they learn it through their eyes, not through their ears. And so because of that method of operating, they don't always know where to turn when they have a vision loss because they've relied on it so heavily for many years without realizing that there's other senses that you could use for other at other times.
So tell me this. One thing we did talk about on the phone, you started going into it, and I said, oh, hold on, Tom. I want to save this for the podcast because I don't like to script anything, and this is just off the top. But you did tell me. Now, for the hams listening, listen to this, okay? Tom told me, and he'll elaborate right now, that he goes out in his homeowners association, his HOA, and sets up his own antennas. And again, he doesn't have sight. So tell us, Tom, what do you use? What are your antennas you use? Tell us all about how you set up your antennas for HF on your current situation.
Okay, so I have two primary antennas that I'm using. I got a 2040 dipole that I use, and this is the one I use most commonly, just because from learning and experimenting, a dipole works better than an in-fed wire any day. But so the dipole works like this. Basically, I set the center point of the antenna up inside of a kitty litter bucket with a soda beams mast, and inside this bucket there's a tube that's surrounded by rocks to weight it down so that the bucket is self-supporting and self-sustaining. And then the tube goes in there, and then the mast goes inside the tube. And that basically goes up about 21, 22 feet, 7 meters, whatever that is. And then on the sides, for the supporting of the sides dipole, I use additional kitty litter buckets that have the same configuration, except instead of the masts like that, I use like golf retriever poles that basically will support those other legs, so that all this stuff is all lightweight. The mast in the middle is fiberglass, and the poles on the sides are aluminum based. And so I use those buckets with about 40 pounds of rocks in them each. I think the center mast has a little bit more because it's the center point has to hold more up. Has to have the strain of the other two, but in general, that's how that antenna works. And the other antenna that I use is it's an end-fed wire. It's a MCOM2 from Chameleon, and basically what I do with stuff. Right, and what I do with that one is I put that on one of those hooks on the end of the porch, so that supports the end of the antenna that has the matching unit. And then I take that wire and I keep it up about maybe 12 or 15 feet. And then I take those same buckets that I've talked about, and about every 20 or 30 feet along that thing, I'll put another bucket and hold it up, another support point, hold it up. And so that wire is about 60 feet long and it wraps around the house. So I basically use that, and that's how I get on like 80 meters, because the other antenna won't really do it very well. That's the antenna I use for 80-meter action.
So what are your for those who are those who are listening to this and living in an HOA, because I made several videos about this, what do they say about your antenna? And I want to ask you this: do they give you any sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Do they know you're making an antenna out there when you set it up? And is it because of your disability, or do they? How do you get around this? Because there's people out there still telling me to this day they can't put up anything in the backyard, even if it's just a 14-foot piece of wire, because the mayor of their HOA is going to come out and yell at them. And you're telling me you do this in an HOA? How? So is that because they like you? Because you can figure it out and do it, stealthy? What do you think?
Well, I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, obviously, I, do this mainly on the weekends, that kind of thing for the most part, and also I'm fortunate to have an end unit apartment where I actually have the corner. So there's not really anybody that's really going to pass through my yard unless they have a real reason to. And so, I've kind of been fortunate that way. And if they were to ever question me, basically, it's a situation where when I'm in here and there's happens to be a hurricane or something like that, the cell phones do go out around here. And if I can't get out and talk, well, I've got a very compromised situation. So, my ability to get in a car and drive away and go to McDonald's and get food, well, I can't do that. If I got all that food spoiled in the fridge and I don't have a way of communicating with the outside world other than a cell phone, I'm up the creek pretty quick.
Right. Well, when all else fails, ham radio is there. That's what I've been preaching for years. I mean, this is, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and I'm not much of a prepper type or whatever, but I always have my ham radio stuff ready to go, because it's not that I think that the zombies are going to come knock at my door and beat it down. It's the fact that I have been in hurricanes in Florida. I have been here where the cell phones go down and everything loses power. And here I am with batteries outside and solar panels and portable antennas and radios where I can, listen to the National Weather Service, or I can listen to AM radio to hear what's going on, or FM radio locally, or whatever. But that's, ham radio. This is the justice that ham radio is. When all else fails, that is our medium. And a lot of people still frown upon it and say, well, I got a prepaid cell phone in case my other cell phone quits. No, it doesn't work like that. When the tower goes down and you have nothing, all that's left, nobody can keep you, ham radio, you can keep in contact, right, Tom, with anybody that you need to, locally or abroad, when everything else fails.
Absolutely. The ham radio communications infrastructure, it's not sharing the same equipment that the telcos use. It's all independent, and a lot of that stuff is direct between you and who else. And obviously, you get to be able to communicate with somebody outside of the disaster area, and they might be able to reach somebody.
I got a question. Can you use ham radio Deluxe, or a program for like WinLink, or a cat control software? Have you used that? Does it have assistive abilities to it?
So some of the cat control programs and things do. WinLink is it's a work in progress for me, mainly because I'm having to use the command line tools, because the native WinLink application, the workforce behind that really hasn't been really that receptive to the accessibility plight. And that's very common in volunteer type software where there's not a commercial company behind it. And there's not really a heck of a lot we can do about that. If they say no, they don't want to do it, you can't force them, because they're not a commercial company and there's no way to make money on it for them. But in saying that, there is a command line program that I've been working with lately over VHF. I haven't done it over HF yet. It's a program called PAT, where you can use it with like those little Raspberry Pi computers and things like that to do WinLink with I've done it on AX25, the packet stuff on VHF. I haven't done it with HF yet. And then rig control, yes. N3FJP, that particular suite of programs, definitely will do your rig control for your program, and that's the one I use mostly. I haven't really tried any of the other ones myself for logging purposes, because I found that N3FJP just is simple for what it does, and I do a bit of contesting and things like that. So those programs are very contest focused. It does one thing and what does one thing well.
So would you say, Tom, let's say that you can tell any of the manufacturers or any of the equipment, manufacturers, whatever, with your disability, would you say, what would your outlook be on the ham radio market? Do we need more manufacturers and people catering to people with disabilities like this? Do you think that there is a lack of it? Do you think that more things can happen? What is your thoughts on that?
So I think that, I think there's always room for improvement potentially on that. I wish more radios that the other brands would put a little bit more effort into it, because it really doesn't really cost that much to do it based on the amount of radios that are sold. I mean, yes, we have a niche hobby, and there might only be, let's say, 1 million of a radio sold, but it's easier to put it into something where you're going to sell 1 million of a radio versus something that you're only going to sell a couple of hundred. So putting that into the radios isn't really as much of a plight as they might want to think that it is. And I think they also should consider doing it more because, like it or not, the demographics of the ham radio hobby is in an older population. And once you get old, things start to happen to the human body. I wish it wasn't that way, but the reality is there are more people in this world that are blind or partially sighted that go blind or partially sighted at an older age versus, being born with it like I am. So I think there's always room for improvement on that front.
Yeah, I get you. So so Tom, at this point, right? So we got about 19 minutes left, and what I want to do is I have some questions for you, man, and I'm begging to ask these questions, and I want your outlook on this. And for anybody listening, we're talking with Tom KF4YEY in Florida, who is a Tom? What would I say? Would I say? Is it bad for me to say a blind person or a sighted? What would be the proper term?
Okay, so me personally, I don't respond badly to either way to say blind or visually impaired, and the reason why that I respond equally to either one is because visually impaired, in my mind, yes, is it the politically correct way to say the term? Yes, but in my way of thinking, is visually impaired basically means that you have some loss of visual acuity, but you still have some residual left. Well, that's not the case in my case. I've never had it, never gonna get it, and that's just the way it is. In fact, when I was about 25 years old, I was dealing with an eye doctor guy who would come down from Virginia every so often, and I would do his computer work for him to set him up in his rental house. And I got to talking to him one day, and I sent him my eye records, and I says, is there ever going to be a situation where I'd be able to see? And he says, let me ask you this. He says, how's your experience been blind so far? I says, I'm fine with it. He says, good. He says, because as long as you're happy with it, it makes me feel more comfortable answering your question. He says, those Cat 5 cables you guys use that have got like 8 or 10 wires in them? And I says, yeah. He says, well, think about that optic nerve. Instead of it being 8 or 10 wires, he says, think about it being a 1,000,000 wired cable. And if you get any one of those 1,000,000 wires wrong, you could cause more damage trying to give yourself something that you really don't need. He says, well, I could give you your vision, but would you like it at the cost of your sense of smell or some type of a reduced mental capacity? I'm like, no, that wouldn't do me any good. He says, good. He says, leave it alone.
Wow. That's deep. That's deep. I mean, So I don't want to say disabled because obviously you do just as well as everybody else doing stuff for IT or radio. I mean, I don't call it a disability at this point. I mean, maybe it is, but that's why I was asking you, because technically with my one eye being removed, I have a visual impairment, but I can still see out of one eye. But am I disabled? I don't think so. And I don't think you're disabled either. That's why I asked that question, because there's people out there that are probably blind that wouldn't know how to do what you do, Tom. And they wouldn't know how to use a smartphone blind, even if the assistive technologies existed or the radios had a synthesizer, a speech processor, they wouldn't know how to do it. So that's why I asked, because, I just want to make sure, I'm not asking anything to try to be disrespectful. I have to be blunt and ask, because that's how this podcast is. I want to know, because my mind is a sponge, I got to know this information.
Right. And, there's a lot of situations where, you just got to try to have a positive outlook. When you encounter a situation where you have a setback, you got to say, well, this is what I've got left. What can I do with it? If you have a negative attitude about your predicament, well, then you're going to stay where you are or backslide. You just got to look at the bright side and say, well, I'm still here. My brain still functions. What can I do?
Yes.
Work your way through it.
Exactly. So before I ask these questions, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, because I usually do it at the end of the show. And before I get into these questions, I want to say Ham Radio Prep. You've heard about me, talked about them, right, Tom?
Absolutely.
So Ham Radio Prep is a good sponsor of mine. Thank you to Ham Radio Prep for helping me do this kind of stuff like this. They gave me the code EricPodcast20. For anybody listening, if you want to get into ham radio, the first place I would start is HamRadioPrep.com, and you can use the code EricPodcast20. You save 20% on any course you buy. Start with a technician class. You can go with general and extra, but they gave me that code, and they are a sponsor of mine. They do a really great thing with the new American Radio Club that I'm going to talk about in a video soon. You get your license at Ham Radio Prep. Now what? Well, the what is going to be amateur radio or American Radio Club that they have to talk with Elmers and people like me and everybody else that will give you insight on what you can do with your ham radio and how to make contacts and which radios you buy and this and that. So thank you to Ham Radio Prep, and the code that they gave me for all my podcast listeners is EricPodcast20. You save 20%. So thank you for Ham Radio Prep and supporting me to be able to do this. Now, Tom, I got some questions for you, buddy, and I want to ask you some of these questions, okay? Now, you were born without sight you've never seen, okay? If I told you or said the sky is blue and there's not a cloud in the sky and it's blue, what does that mean to you, Tom? You've never seen colors. What does that mean when someone says blue or like the sky or green like the grass? What does that mean to you?
So when it comes to colors, I kind of have to just do it from memorization of the spectrum scale, where red is a brighter color and black or white, they're darker colors or whatever. And so it's difficult to relate to that sort of thing. So I try not to use colors in my everyday life to, associate things. I try to use other mechanisms to be able to do that, because colors are not something I can experience. It's almost like dangling a carrot to somebody and say, well, I'm going to give you this, but they never wind up giving it to you. And after a while, you figure out, well, that person really didn't intend to give me that carrot to begin with. And so you kind of disappoint yourself with that. So I don't really deal with colors too well, and I don't always remember even what matches. So I have to get people to tell me, to say, hey, this color goes with that color. So I have to be reminded of something like that. So it's not something I really relate to very, very well in general terms. But just about every other concept in the world I get.
I understand. It's fascinating to me to think that I can't explain to somebody what a color would be. Like if I said a puffy white cloud in the sky. Well, you brought this up on the phone. Another thing you brought up, and I said, hold on a second. You told me, you said when someone says, like you said, the antennas are normally up in the air on a tower, or they may be 135 foot off-center fed dipole. You can't see that unless you touch it, right? Because you're on a base of feel and sense of smell and stuff. So the same thing like an antenna that's on top of a tower. You can feel the base of a tower. You can feel it, and you can run your hands up and say, wow, this thing goes up, and I know there's an antenna on the top. But once it goes up beyond your reach, you can't comprehend unless you touch the antenna, and not every time do you get to touch an antenna, right? So a Yagi, you can understand that there's a radiator in the middle, then a director in the front, a reflector in the back, and you can draw it, or someone could put it in a scale on a desk for you to feel. But beyond an antenna on top of a tower, let's put it this way. If someone said when you're at the beach, you've been to the beach, Tom, I'm sure you have, you live in Florida. If someone says, well, you can look out as far as you can see, and it's all water as far as you can see, but what does that do in your mind? You can feel the water, you can swim the water, but when someone says, how does your never having sight go on infinity as far as you can see?
Well, that's an interesting question, because when I was a teenager, we had a situation where somebody held up an orange, and I says, well, how far away could you see that orange? And the guy says, well, I can see it about 20 feet, but he says, once you get, let's say, 10 or 12 feet or some distance like that, you basically start to lose its clarity about the details of it that you can see. So to answer that question, as far as infinity goes, basically you kind of just say, okay, this is what's in front of me, and that's all there is for as far as the visual acuity goes, because I don't know, can you see a mile out, 2 miles out, 5 miles out? And the other question becomes let's turn it around to the other perspective. Obviously, when you look up at the sky, one concept that's extremely difficult for me to understand is like at nighttime, the whole concept of stars, because, in general, you have the star, which is the sun that you experience in the daytime, but at nighttime, once the lights go out, in my mind, dark is dark, but that's not really how it really works in the real world. You can actually see what I've been described as little twinkles of light from other stars that you could see that because my light perception doesn't exist anymore, even when it did exist, I could only see a light bulb inside a single room. So my light perception experience was relatively limited as to very bright objects.
I never thought about that, Tom. I never thought about trying to explain to somebody that there's stars a million miles away and you can see them. And like you said, night and day. I never thought about that. Let me ask you this, Tom. If colors are a difficult comprehension for you, and this is a really, really tough one for me to wrap my head around. Do you dream? And if you dream, what do you see? And it's got to be something different than what I would pertain to, because if you've never seen anything, do you dream, Tom? Do you have images in your dreams? I got to know.
Images, no, but I do have the same type of real-world experience that you might have in your dreams, such as the feelings that go on when you have a dream. And the reason why I don't have the images in my dreams is because my brain has never processed images before. And so because my optic nerves have never worked to be able to send the information from the eye back to the brain doesn't know how imagery works at all. And then people that have been able to see before and lost their vision through whatever that they wind up losing their vision from, whether it's a disease or an accident or something like that, they actually say that their vision in their dreams is still present, but over a period of years it gets less and less or faded.
I see, because they've once seen images but the mind does some crazy things, man. The brain, I've had images of people and things, and sometimes when I wake up, I don't know what I was looking at or who it was in my dream, but I know it was there. And I was just curious because, the mind does crazy things, man. And, so you're saying you can dream and have a cognitive, or when you wake up, realize what you were dreaming about, but you never saw anything?
Right, because there's no sensory input from the eyes in the dream or even in real life, or daytime life, as we call it. So the brain doesn't present that information to me because the wires have never been connected.
Wow, that's insane. I have one more question for you, because my wife asked, because I did talk to her about you, and she she knows my fascination with this, Tom. I am not using you as a podcast person. I am fascinated by this, and I have to ask because some people wouldn't let me ask these questions, And as far as ham radio and stuff, the Ham Radio Concepts podcast, again, I could do whatever I want in this podcast. I could talk about ground beef next week, but I try to keep it ham related. But I have right now a sensory overload. I'm probably going to think about this the rest of the night talking, and I appreciate your time doing this because I really wanted. I've talked to you on D-Star and stuff, but I've never gotten to do. I kind of wouldn't do this over ham radio. You know what I mean? So let me ask you this, because my wife had one question. Now, she had like one, which turns into two. So so picture a mirror. A mirror shows you a reflection, or a sliding glass door is clear and you can see through it. But what does that mean to you? She wanted to know, well, you can feel it. You understand in your head that you can't see through a brick wall, but you can see through a sliding glass door, or a mirror shows you the image. But if you've never looked in a mirror, Tom, is there anything you can input on that for her? Because what does that mean to you? A clear border, or a clear wall that you can touch, but you can see through it.
So we know that there's certain materials that you can see through and certain ones you can't. And then there's other materials that have varying degrees of visualness, such as the difference between a window versus a tinted window, where it lets in some of the light or doesn't let out all the light. And there's, one-way windows and two-way windows where you could see out, but you can't see in, those kind of things. And so basically when it comes to the whole window idea, is I have to assume that window is completely see-through, even though it may not be, just because you don't know whether it is or isn't. So you have to be careful. For example, as an example, when you're doing something in your living room and you have that screened-in door and then that glass door on your porch, well, you probably don't want to change your clothes in your living room because you just don't know who might be able to see you from that back porch.
Right, yeah, I get you.
Not that there is anybody looking, it's just that the possibility exists.
Well, it's like I always say, you never know who's watching or you never know who's listening. There's a lot of repeaters I get on, and you never know. People listen on the repeaters on ham radio, and they won't respond, but they'll yell at that radio. They just don't push the button. You never know who's listening. Same thing like you said, you never know who's watching, or who can see you. Tom, we're gonna wrap this up here because I want to give you a minute or two on your own here. But so everybody listening, WRMI 9.395 megahertz, 5.950 megahertz, every 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. every Sunday evening from WRMI, and anywhere you can find a podcast, you can look up the Ham Radio Concepts podcast. Tom, I want to give you a minute or so, and I want you to say whatever you want to talk about, anything you want to say. Give me a minute. I want to thank you for being on my podcast. This means the world to me. I think this is probably the most interesting podcast episode out of the 10 that I've done that I've ever had. And I appreciate that because you've opened my eyes and you've made me something that I'm going to think about the rest of the night. And I'm fascinated. But go ahead, Tom. Give me a minute or so. Anything you want to say, anything in the world. What would you want to say on the Ham Radio Concepts podcast?
I basically want to say that for anybody who wants to get into this hobby, do it, jump into it. There's plenty of people that'll help you out, and people that have disabilities or whatever. There's always help. We're just a real welcoming community in general, and for those that want to potentially reach out to me again, feel free to do that at KF4YEY at gmail.com, and I'll respond back and try to help you in any way that I can.
That is awesome. Yeah, I hope that the community appreciates this podcast, and I hope that manufacturers listen, because again, I'm talking to you as if I didn't even know that you had this visual impairment or sightedness or whatever you want to call it. But you're amazing, Tom. And man, we're gonna be able to meet, go to dinner. My treat at Orlando at next Ham Fest. We usually go every year to Grills on the Water after Ham Fest. Can I invite you to dinner there, buddy, and get to meet you?
Absolutely, we'll definitely do it,
dude. You get a hold of Jan or me or somebody, and we will do this. You got my number, I got your number, and I'd love to sit with you and have a dinner and just chat. But thank you very much, Tom, for being on here. Thank you for your time, and I hope you like the podcast. Hope you play it back and listen to it. So to wrap it up here with 45 seconds to go, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you to my sponsors again, HamRadioPrep.com. You can use the code EricPodcast20 and get 20% off on anything you buy. Thank you for them for supporting me doing this. Thank you for WRMI.net for letting me buy these time slots and have this stuff like this go out on the shortwave air. I hope everybody has, this isn't for me, guys. This podcast is for us. I want somebody just to be able to talk and learn, and I learn. Look, this isn't for me, man. I'm learning from Tom. So thank you, Tom, very much, and thank you for everybody listening. This is KJ4YEY, same as 73, and Tom, go ahead.
This is KF4YEY, and my name is Tom.
Thank you, everybody. 7-3.